Good morning and thanks for being with us. Welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I am Ladi Akeriduluale. The headlines. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addresses the United Nations Security Council. Russia says Ukraine's special services staged alleged killings of civilians. And EU outlines new sanctions against Russia. The Commission has proposed sweeping new sanctions against Russia, including banning coal imports and halting trade worth nearly 20 billion euros in retaliation over possible war crimes in that country. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says existing sanctions may have damaged Russia's economy, but more were needed. The proposed measures, which must be approved by all 27 European Union states, include the banning of imports of coal, wood, cement, liquor, and seafood. The restrictions would also hit caviar, vodka, rubber, and chemicals. According to Mrs. von der Leyen, the Commission is working on banning oil imports as well. The proposals come as part of the West's response to the gruesome discovery of civilians shot at close range in Bucha, a town outside Kiev that was seized back from Russian forces. Moscow had said the deaths in Bucha were a monstrous forgery staged by the West to discredit it. The mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko, is also urging nations to stop doing business with Russia. Mrs. von der Leyen had earlier said that the proposals include a ban on Russian vessels and Russian-operated vessels from accessing EU ports, and a ban on exports to Russia, including of advanced semiconductors, quantum computers, and other electrical and transport equipment. Earlier in the week, Washington had targeted Russia's ability to pay its debt obligations by stopping the Russian government from paying holders of its sovereign debt more than $600 million from reserves held at U.S. banks, in a move meant to Russia pressure on Moscow, raising the risk of default.
We are proposing to take our sanctions a step further. We will make them broader and sharper so that they cut even deeper into the Russian economy. With this, we will continue to degrade Russia's technological base and industrial capacity.
Moving on to the White House, which is also including Russian banks and officials in the sweeping sanctions announced starting today. The West's punishment of Moscow over its actions or alleged actions in Ukraine has been given new impetus following the claims of civilian murders in Bucha.
I think he's certainly referring to, obviously he can speak for himself, but his frustration, which we share, that Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. We don't see that changing. And so what our objective is at this point in time is on a couple of fronts. One is to continue to provide a range of security assistance to Ukraine, directly to Ukraine, to the military that is serving boldly and bravely on their behalf. I can provide you a little bit of an update on that in addition to the deliveries of the $200 million package announced on March 12th, which are almost complete, deliveries of the $800 million package that the President announced on March 16th are actively occurring, and obviously the Department of Defense has also announced a range of equipment that is being provided. I'd also note that there are a range of mechanisms as it relates to accountability, and that relates to the President's strong statements about his view and belief that Russia and President Putin are guilty of war crimes and obviously the atrocities that have taken place. And they are not necessarily through the UN mechanisms. And there are obviously challenges to that given Russia is a permanent member. But there are ample examples in the past of other international bodies, and we will continue to support those efforts as well.
And at the UN Security Council, which is meeting on the Ukraine crisis, has been holding a meeting on the matter overnight. Addressing the session, the Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for an end to the conflict, urging serious negotiations for peace based on the principles of the United Nations Charter. Russia's permanent representative to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, said Russia is taking humanitarian actions each day, while on the contrary, the Ukrainian side has deliberately obstructed them. He accused people he called radicals of Ukraine of using civilians as human shields while accusing Russia of the killings. So far, Russia has not submitted any evidence related to the alleged mass killings in the Ukrainian town of Bucha. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, blamed Russia for what he said was the deliberate slaughter of civilians in Bucha, calling for full and transparent investigations by the international community. China's permanent representative to the United Nations, Mr. Zhang Jun, said at the meeting that de-escalation and putting an early end to the conflict in Ukraine is the earnest expectation of the international community and the strong desire of China. The Russian Federation and Ukraine have had 2 rounds of negotiations, and China is asking both sides to stick to the general direction of peace, overcome difficulties and differences, and continue to build conditions for a comprehensive settlement of the crisis. He insists negotiations and dialogue are the only path leading to peace, urging the international community to create favorable conditions and environments for negotiations between both sides. He promises China will continue to promote peaceful talks while playing a constructive and responsible role in resolving the Ukrainian crisis. Speaking on the humanitarian issue, the Chinese envoy called on the parties to abide by international humanitarian law, and civilians should be spared of any forms of violence in armed conflicts. He, however, believes the relevant circumstances and specific causes of the incident in Bucha should be verified and established so that any accusations will be based on facts, and that before the full picture is clear, all sides should exercise restraint and avoid unfounded accusations.
Greatest challenges ever to the international order of hunger and famine. This is not the time for protectionism. The war in Ukraine must stop now. We need serious negotiations for peace based on the principles of the United Nations Charter.
Let's move to other stories, but still related to this. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has defended America's response to the war in Ukraine during a heated exchange with a Republican lawmaker who accused the Pentagon of overestimating Russia's military capabilities. Austin and other U.S. officials say U.S. support to Ukrainian forces, along with Ukraine's strong will to fight, has thwarted Russia's plans for a swift victory in its now more than a long invasion. Russia's United Nations envoy Vasily Nebenzia told the United Nations Security Council, and that's returning to New York, that Russian troops are not targeting civilians in Ukraine, dismissing accusations of abuse as lies. Russia says it is carrying out a special military operation that aims to destroy Ukraine's military infrastructure and denazify it, and denies attacking civilians. Ukraine says it was invaded without a provocation. Mr. Nebenzia said Moscow was trying to bring peace to Ukraine's breakaway eastern Donbas region and was not trying to conquer lands in Ukraine. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, said responsible world powers and global leaders need to show backbone and stand up to Russia's dangerous and unprovoked threat against Ukraine and the world. 7 million Ukrainians, about a quarter of the total population, have fled their homes. More than 4 million of those have left the Ukraine.
This moment requires responsible world powers and global leaders to show some backbone and stand up to Russia's dangerous and unprovoked threat against Ukraine and the world. The Secretary General said that confronting this threat is the Security Council's charge. It is, and it is also the responsibility of UN leaders and leaders around the world, every single member state with a voice in the GA. No one can be a shield for Russia's aggression. Suspending Russia from the Human Rights Council is something we collectively have the power to do in the General Assembly. Our votes can make a real difference.
Recent reports of civilian killings in Bushehr are deeply disturbing. We unequivocally condemn these killings and support the call for an independent investigation.
Before leaving for Brussels for a NATO foreign ministers meeting, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the killings in the Ukrainian town of Bucha were no random act of a rogue unit, but part of a deliberate Russian campaign to commit atrocities. He offered no evidence to support his assertion of a deliberate campaign, but he told reporters Washington backed Ukrainian efforts to investigate what happened. Bucha's deputy mayor, Taras Sheprovsky, says 50 of the dead residents found after Russian forces withdrew from the city late last week were the victims of extrajudicial killings. Russia, which says it launched this military operation in Ukraine on February the 24th to demilitarize its neighbor, denies targeting civilians. And Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov accused the West of trying to derail negotiations between Russia and Ukraine by fueling, quote, hysteria over alleged war crimes by Moscow's forces. Kiev and the West say there is evidence, including images and witness testimony gathered by media organizations, that Russia committed war crimes in the Ukrainian town of Bucha. Moscow denies the charge and has called the allegations a monstrous forgery. Mr. Lavrov said, without providing evidence, that Moscow believed the accusations were timed to wreck the negotiating process after what he described as progress when Ukrainian and Russian representatives met in Turkey last week. Ukraine and Western governments say these demands, presented by President Vladimir Putin at the start of Russia's invasion, were false pretexts for an illegal assault on a democratic country. Hundreds of Ukrainian refugees who fled to Mexico were transported to a sports center that was converted into a government shelter in the northern city of Tijuana as a way to be allowed to cross the border and enter the United States. Some 400 Ukrainians, about 30% of whom are children, arrived in Tijuana on Saturday, April the 2nd, and Sunday, April the 3rd, after entering the country through airports in Cancun and Mexico City, and that's according to the city's Migration Affairs Director, Mr. Enrique Lucero. They joined a growing number of Ukrainians who have escaped war in their home country and are crammed into improvised camps near the international port of entry, which connects Tijuana with California. The increase of Ukrainians there comes as U.S. officials are ramping up efforts to process migrants and asylum seekers, regardless of nationality, amidst an expected increase in arrivals as the United States lifts a pandemic-era policy that effectively shut down asylums at the border. In the shelter, families of migrants rested, ate, and played. U.S. Customs and Border Protection Commissioner Chris Magnum said that the agency is ramping up personnel and resources at the southwest border without providing details about the number of agents being deployed or specific locations for such deployments. The U.S. President Joe Biden said in late March that the United States would accept up to 100,000 Ukrainians to settle in the country this year. We'll take a break, and when we return, we'll talk more about those sweeping sanctions and their effects on how all of this is unfolding in Russia and Ukraine. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Gauges measuring sentiments in the private sector fell in 6 of 7 sub-Saharan African economies tracked last month as supply disruptions from Russia's invasion of Ukraine fan prices. The war has exacerbated trade shocks caused by the coronavirus pandemic and extreme weather. Prices of items such as sunflower oil, crude oil, fertilizer, and wheat have soared since it began. Countries in East and North Africa have seen surges in input costs and output charges that were often a direct result of the conflict. Well, This is Africa. This is close to home. Let's talk, as always, to Laddie Williams of our business desk. Laddie, good morning. It's been a very wet start to the day, especially in the nation's commercial capital. But it's not so wet. The news coming out of the war in Ukraine, especially as it affects Africa.
Yes, because food security right now, global food security is, being threatened at this point. It's surprising to see how much Russia and Ukraine, actually support the global food economy, because at this point, this war has caused a lot of disruptions with major food commodities like wheat, soybean, fertilizer, and the likes. And, all of this is connected. Africa now is being, has felt the pinch of this. Most Middle Eastern and North African countries are feeling the pinch. For example, Egypt now. We've seen Egypt actually raise rates at this point. We've seen their bread subsidy disappear overnight. It's gone over the roof at this point. And now we're seeing that Kenya, also we've seen fuel queues back in Kenya at this point, because also their fuel subsidy prices have gone up because of rising energy costs at this point. So Africa is feeling the pinch. We've seen here in Nigeria, we've seen the cost of diesel soar due to the rise
and
in
you guys have been
prices.
talking about the whole issue of wheat and bread and fertilizer and farming and all of that for the last couple of weeks anyway.
Exactly. So Africa is feeling the pinch at this point. And also Brazil, food basket of the world, that they provide about 25% of global food for the world. But now with fertilizer shortages, they're having issues actually, producing food. So right now, with this, price volatility we're seeing with agricultural commodities, it's telling signs that, a global food shortage is, being exacerbated at this point with this war. So right now, everyone is watching, how do we, reduce this impact, because nobody wants to go hungry at this point.
Nobody does. Nobody does.
We've seen a couple of countries actually adopt food protectionism.
Yeah, saying, look, until we're satisfied, we're not
exporting anything. So it's a big issue at this point.
Now, the EU and the US are slapping even more sanctions against Russia. Even with the dire situation you've already put on ground with regards to food security, more sanctions are coming. There's banks, there's coal, there's all of that still to come up. Is it going to get to a stage perhaps when the global economy, as you've been saying down the weeks, will be impacted by
analysts are already predicting a recession, a global recession at this point, with what's going on here, because now with these new sanctions are taking a new angle. We're looking at secondary sanctions at this point. So if you're doing business with Russia at this point, you could be sanctioned, because at this point you see the US and its allies mount sanctions on Russia, trying to reduce their ability to fund this war. So at the end of the day, with the sanctions, as long as Europe is still buying all of that gas, from Russia, they're still funding the war. They're still making...
And they've got no short-term way out of that.
No short-term way out of it. We've already seen Slovakia actually say, you know what, if it comes to paying in rubles for gas, we will pay in rubles. So at the end of the day, we're seeing, these sanctions come up. And now with this new one for secondary sanctions, if you're doing business with Russia, you could be at risk of actually, being an unfriendly nation to the US.
If you support sanctions, then you'll be on the unfriendly list of Russia.
Exactly.
If you are against sanctions, then you'll be on the unfriendly list of NATO and the US.
Exactly.
So it's like between the rock and the hard place.
And the hard place. So now you have to choose. How do we do this? And obviously we've seen the reliance of Germany on Russian gas. So take, for instance, now this actually goes on with secondary sanctions.
Right.
If Germany buys gas from Russia, that could...
And pays in rubles.
And pays in rubles. That could translates to sanctions for Germany at this point. So these secondary sanctions actually have far-reaching implications at this point. But, they're still, modifying and trying to see how they can actually make it work. By the end of the day, trying to squeeze Russia at this point, it's not easy because there's a lot of dependence on Russia. So it remains to be seen how the U.S. can actually play this card at this point.
Earlier this week, you and I spoke about this crypto and the use of it by Ukraine to fund donations, and we talked about the non-fungible tokens and all of that. Now, that number, from what I have here, is $60 million.
$60 million, right. So they've been getting a lot of donations. Like Ukraine they're getting a lot of support. Even, I was talking to somebody the other day, and most of these freelance websites where you can get gigs and sell stuff, they're supporting Ukraine. They're pushing more Ukrainian sellers, making sure they get their stuff bought on their websites. Whatever you're selling, as long as Ukrainian, you're put up there. So it's heavy support for Ukraine. So a lot of NFTs have been, some of these NFT platforms have been contributing, sending NFTs to Ukraine, so they can sell it, make some money, and actually use to fund, some of their museums and, landmarks that have been destroyed with the war. So at this point, they're now making money from donations with NFTs, and they're also selling NFTs. So it's they're getting a lot of support, really.
This is a complicated trade, mind you.
Quite a complicated one, because, with NFTs, these are non-fungible tokens. These are like pictures, JPEGs on the blockchain.
And people buy those and keep them.
And they buy it and keep. So when with the donations they've gotten now, like one of the popular NFTs, one was the CryptoPunks.
Okay.
They donated about $200,000 worth of that to Ukraine. So Ukraine can actually, liquidate that, take out that money, use to support the country at this point. So they're getting a lot of donations. They're getting a lot of love on all these gig websites. So it's looking good, with the donations coming.
It's looking
Ukraine.
Good,
but at the end of the day, it's not good,
it's not good news. I mean, what's going on the ground?
On the grounds there, we're seeing people dying, at this point. But we've seen
how did the markets react to the possibility, well, of course, now the certainty of a new round of sanctions?
Yeah, the markets didn't react so good yesterday. We saw a lot of pullbacks. We saw pullback in Europe. We saw in the U.S. markets with the Dow Jones and the NASDAQ. NASDAQ fell about 2% yesterday. We also saw Bitcoin actually pull back, also a pullback from that 46,000 range down to about $45,000 this morning. So, investors are weighing these sanctions and, trying to understand, how, because obviously we're seeing inflation actually being stoked with all of this, and we're seeing the Fed also talk about, more aggressive rate hikes. So when you talk rate hikes, the active investors do not like to hear that.
Yeah, they begin to look where the door is.
What are we going to use to hedge at this point? So now they're running out of. We saw a lot of sell-offs yesterday in the equities market. We saw sell-offs in crypto market too. So investors are weighing all the out, but we're seeing oil actually rise at this point. Obviously, supply disruptions will always, boost oil at this point. So we're seeing oil in the green this morning, but major markets are in the red at this point.
I'm sure we'll keep an eye on that on the business desk. Ladi, as always, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
You can join Ladi and Ini later on in the day, right after this show, and at 1:30 in the afternoon. Business Morning, Business Incorporated, the details of this and all the other trending stories in the world of business. Thank you, Ladi. Let's talk now to Dr. Chuka Chukube, Associate Professor, Russian Language and Integration. He joins us virtually from the nation's commercial capital in Lagos. Okay, I understand that I've got it wrong. This is actually Joe Nakwe, who is our energy policy consultant, who joins us from Lekki. Am I right, Mr. Nakwe?
Yes.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a wet morning. I don't know how much of rain you've seen where you are, but it's been a very, very tough start to the day. And if you were listening, Ladi and I were talking about the issue of oil and gas and all the various things that have happened since this war in Ukraine started. But I want to start off from a conversation I had with one of your colleagues. That's another policy consultant who said it's a real big shame that Nigeria, as a country, as an oil and gas producer, has not been able to leverage on its abundance of resources to even make attempts to fill some of the supply gaps that have been created by this conflict. Do you agree with that?
Yes, it's really sad that we are not in a position to take advantage of the market today. So I totally agree with that. If you look at the published reports, I think last February we did 1.15 million barrels. I mean, it's really sad. I wish we were better positioned.
Let's look, of course, at the issue of the pricing here. Locally, as again, I reference what Ladi said and what we've been saying over the last couple of weeks. The price of diesel has gone sky high. The price of aviation fuel has gone sky high. And this, I understand, is because Nigeria's production of all these items is very, very, very constrained, and we're importing. So any disruptions will affect us. Again, how do you see this vis-a-vis what had been our policy of being able to be self-sufficient in ensuring that there are no supply disruptions?
Okay. There are two issues here. One is the pass-through effect. So the prices we see today are essentially imported prices, if you will. So that's a challenge for us as a nation. I wish, again, we were in a position where we were refining our products domestically. So that is part of it. But the other thing to note is that Russia, prior to now, controls about 15% of the global petroleum product trade. So that's massive. So if anything happens to that, of course, that will have an effect globally, and everybody it's being seen across the world. So what we are experiencing here is not just unique to us; it's being seen everywhere. But like I said, you wish we had sufficient enough domestic refining capacity. It would have helped us quite a bit at this point, but sadly we don't. So we're exposed to that challenge. But indeed, it's a global one.
Is this a symptom or a consequence of policy failure or absence on our part?
Well, the way to think about it is 20 years ago, thereabout, we said we were going to change our fiscal laws. We indicated to the investment community that we were going to change the entire body of laws that guides or regulates the oil and gas industry. In a sense, what we did was to inject uncertainty into the market. So if you're going to change the law and I'm an investor, I would rather wait until I see the new law before I make commitment. So 20 years after, we finally got the PIA passed last year. But again, it's too late. What that means is that for 20 years, little or no investment was done in the sector, whether it's in the midstream, upstream, or downstream. So that's the result of that tardiness on our side. We were not able to do what we needed to do in that time frame because we were busy trying to get the laws fixed. So it took us so long, and now we're here. So in a sense, we didn't do what we were supposed to do 20 years back. And if you look at the numbers, we just have not been able to attract investment in that time frame. Investment has been very, very low, and that's how we got to this sorry pass today.
It's not just that we have not been getting investments. It does appear as if many of the majors are also consolidating their operations, and I hate to use the word, but it looks like quite a number of them are divesting and actually leaving for other places. In the 20-year period you've mentioned, many other countries which didn't have oil or had limited supplies have expanded their production capacity. So that appears to be, you know, the lure for these oil majors to leave and go elsewhere.
You're right. You're very right on that. The landscape has significantly changed in that time frame. We have found oil in areas where no one thought oil would be found. So the companies have to realign their global portfolios. But beyond that, remember that in the time frame that these companies, that same period, the companies never didn't go. So they were here, but they were not investing. I think the point needs to be made that they were on a wait and see kind of posture. So you had the companies, ExxonMobil was here all through, but not a whole lot. So they were basically producing what has been developed before that time frame. So no major FIDs were taken for the most part. So that resulted in this situation. Yes, there are a lot of pressures on the company. So they are realigning their global portfolios. That's one. Then there are specific country-specific risk. We know about oil theft. We know about the very harsh operating environment. So those are some of the things that has fueled a relook at their portfolio. So they're basically saying, well, this is a very tough place to do business, and we might as well go elsewhere. And there are opportunities elsewhere now. So we're not held to this to Nigeria. We're not stuck to Nigeria in a sense. So yes, it's a combination of several factors that has brought us here.
Of course, there have been also infrastructure developments. As we were talking now, I saw a visual of Nord Stream 2, which is a gas pipeline in Europe, of course, which is supposed to pass through Ukraine and all that and bring Russian gas to the Western allies, which is at the center of this conflict because they can't get out of the situation fast enough, so it seems. But because of infrastructure projects like that, there's another in Canada, which the Canadian government itself took over. And then there are some on the African continent linking Angola. There's a new gas development field in Mozambique and all of that. But Nigeria seems to have remained static during this period. So I guess the question to ask going forward is, what do we do now? Because this war in Ukraine is almost like a wake-up call for us. So what are we going to do? What are we to do? If you are in a position to list some steps?
Yes, I think we have a new law now, the PIA. It's not perfect, but it's good enough, I think. I think we need to implement it very aggressively. We need to get, double down essentially. There's a lot, we need to reassure the investment community that this is still a viable place to put money. We need to, bend over. There's a lot of work in terms of getting the environment, the operating environment, safe enough and appealing enough for investors. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that area. In terms of what happens, remember the anchor trust of that law is attracting investment. So the earlier we get to start doing that, we need to equally look at our regulatory framework to ensure that it's robust enough, for what is to come. So those are the things we can do. I think we've missed this particular boat, but hopefully we won't miss the next one.
Of course, the Petroleum Industry Act, which you have referenced, that it took us so long to put in place, and that even though it's not perfect, it's there now. Its implementation has also been suspended for 18 months, so we're told, because of the other big elephant in the room, which is the issue of subsidy, which is not just an economic issue, but it's also a political one. And it does look as if we're at a transition. Less than a year from now, a new government is expected to be elected. And therefore, again, the investors are adopting a wait-and-see attitude to see how all of this unfolds. So again, it goes back to the uncertainty that you started the conversation with.
Well, yes. I think we need to clarify the PIA was not suspended. It is just an aspect of the PIA, which is the deregulation of the market, Section 205, that was put on hold. Uh, so there are elements of the PIA that are still being implemented. What I pray and I hope is that those who are responsible will approach it with all seriousness and do what needs to be done in short order, because time is running out on us. So that's very key. I think the issue of deregulation or no deregulation has been flogged to death. I think at some point that will happen. But that did not put the PIA on hold. I think I just needed to clarify that.
Very good, because the other question then, of course, is that if you're right, as it is, as you say, that it has not been put on hold, just that section of it that deals with deregulation, I go back to the question where I said that deregulation or otherwise is the big elephant in the room, and which is probably what so many people are saying is holding back the investors. If you won't put in money where you don't expect to get back your money, plus, you know, some reasonable margin to enable that investment be worth it, would you?
You're right. You're right. You're very right on that. So the regulation is like, in my view, is long overdue. I think we should have done it a long time ago, especially when oil prices were sub 40. That was the right time to do it, but we did it. Okay. But the issue is we need to attract investment, not just in the midstream, which is where refining and the regulation issues have been dealt with. We just haven't, like I said, we had at some point, a couple of years back, we did 2.5 million barrels of oil a day. You don't need deregulation to ramp up capacity in the upstream, right? So where we are today, the point I'm making is the regulation is a key issue. We need to deal with it. It will help us with attracting investment in domestic refining and the downstream. However, we just have not been able to attract investment, not even in the upstream. I mean, how do we go from 2.5 at some point to 1.15? Today, our production is so low that even at these high oil prices, we don't feel the effect. That's a major challenge. And that's why I say we need to continue to very seriously implement provisions of the PIA that will hopefully unlock the potentials across the value chain, including the midstream, where the regulation will be most impactful.
As my final question to you, looking forward, so many people have talked about, you know, oil being Nigeria's small resource and gas being the big resource. It was in the news a day or two ago that the Minister of State for Petroleum, acting on behalf of the federal government, accused the oil majors, who are also partners in the Nigerian LNG project, of imposing constraints that is not allowing the LNG to maximize the situation as it is here, especially because the world now needs gas. Beyond the back and forth of accusations and counter accusations, in terms of the gas, this was supposed to be the decade of gas, so we're told. What do we need to do in that regard?
We need to invest. We need to invest in gas, whether it's in the upstream, midstream, and the downstream. There's a massive gap in infrastructure that needs to be built. There is a huge gap even on the supply side. So we need to invest. Again, back to what we were discussing, we need an environment that will assure investors that, you know, this is the right place to invest. Without investment in the upstream, you won't produce the gas. Without investment in the midstream, you won't be able to move the gas from point A to point B. So there is need for investment. And we need to do everything to assure the investment community that indeed we have a winner here in Nigeria. So that's, without saying too much, that's what I would like to say.
Mr. Joe Nakwe, energy policy consultant, thank you so much for your time this morning. one will only hope that a lot of the food for thought that you've given will be taken up by the necessary authorities. Thank you once again for your time.
Thank you, Ladi. Have a beautiful day.
We'll go on a short break. After that, Russia's Football Federation has dropped an appeal against FIFA's World Cup suspension. Please stay on with us. For staying tuned, welcome back. We had told you earlier on in the program that U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin defended America's response to the war in Ukraine during a heated exchange with a Republican lawmaker who had accused the Pentagon of overestimating Russia's military capabilities. General Austin and other U.S. officials had said U.S. support for Ukrainian forces, along with Ukraine's strong will to fight, had thwarted Russia's plans for a swift victory in its now more than 1 month-long invasion.
We've seen much of the same imagery that you have. Obviously, we are in touch with our Ukrainian counterparts. We're certainly in no position to refute.
Well, General Austin doesn't seem to be making an appearance on the program today, but we'll see how we can get that in before we go. But in the meantime, the situation on the ground in Ukraine is still mixed. So let's take a look at a recap of what happened 24 hours.
Ukraine's president addressed the United Nations Security Council, accusing Russia of genocide and asking the West for more military aid to fight the invasion. His address comes after evidence emerged from around Kiev suggesting mass civilian killings by Russian forces. President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russian forces are trying to hide the traces of their war crime and alleges that more than 300 people were tortured in Bucha, near Kiev. Russia has dismissed the allegation of war crime, calling it propaganda, and claims Ukraine staged civilian deaths.
We're having Russian PR, Vasily Nebenzia.
Moscow is set to defend itself at the Council, where it holds veto power, and has promised to present evidence that its forces were not involved.
We have factual evidence that proves this point. We intend to present it to Security Council as soon as possible, so that the international community is not misled by the false narrative promoted by Kiev and its Western sponsors.
European Commission President has set out proposals for new sanctions targeting Russia's economy. In a statement, she accused Moscow of waging a cruel and ruthless war and said its alleged atrocities in Ukraine cannot and will not be left unanswered.
We all saw the gruesome pictures from Bucha and other areas from which Russian troops have recently left. Yesterday, I conveyed to President Zelensky my condolences and assured him of the European Commission's full support in these terrible times. These atrocities cannot and will not be left unanswered. The 4 packages of sanctions have hit hard and limited the Kremlin's political and economic options. We're seeing tangible results, but clearly, in view of events, we need to increase our pressure further. So today we are proposing to take our sanctions a step further. We will make them broader and sharper so that they cut even deeper into the Russian economy. This 5th package has 6 pillars. First, we will impose an import ban on coal from Russia worth 4 billion euros per year. This will cut another important revenue source for Russia. Second, a full transaction ban on 4 key Russian banks, among them VTB, the 2nd largest Russian bank. These 4 banks, which we now totally cut off from the markets, represent 23% of market share in the Russian banking sector. This will further weaken Russia's financial system. Third, a ban on Russian vessels and Russian-operated vessels from accessing EU ports.
The US, EU and UK have together sanctioned more than 1,000 Russian individuals and businesses seen as being close to the Kremlin. Western nations have also frozen the assets of Russia's central bank.
Every cent what you receive from Russians.
The mayor of Kiev has urged European governments to cut off all business ties to Moscow, insisting that payments that continue to Russia are covered in blood.
In sports, Russia's Football Federation has dropped an appeal against FIFA's World Cup suspension that was imposed after the country's invasion of Ukraine. The Football Union of Russia had protested against the ban, but the Court of Arbitration for Sports says that the FUR has now withdrawn that appeal. Russia had qualified to face Poland in a playoff semi-final, but the Poles instead received a bye to face Sweden. However, Russia says it will continue to fight bans from other sporting competitions. Finally, on the program this morning, Kalush Orchestra, Ukraine's representative for the 2022 Eurovision contest, performed in front of an audience of Ukrainian refugees and Jewish immigrants in Jerusalem. The folk rap group arrived in Israel to participate in a mini Eurovision song contest in Tel Aviv in the build-up to the European Annual Contest, one of the world's largest televised events, which will take place in Turin, Italy in May. The crowd cheered as the group performed Stefania, their Eurovision entry. The Israeli organizers of the event say it is the first time the group got together since the war started. That's our package on the program this morning. Thanks for joining us. There'll be an update at 5 o'clock later on in the day. Do watch out for that. For the rest of this Wednesday, do have yourselves a good day. I'm Ladi Akiriduluale.